Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, everyone, buckle up because we're diving into some seriously fascinating territory today, Eisenhower's New Look. You guys requested this one, and I gotta say, it's a doozy.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We're talking about a guy, a war hero no less, who bases his entire foreign policy around the threat of nuclear war. I mean, talk about a paradox, right?
Right.
So was he a genius or reckless? Or maybe a little of both?
It's a question historians are still trying to figure out. And for good reason, it's complicated. To really get New Look, you got to rewind back to '53. You've got Stalin's death, which obviously threw the Soviet Union into a bit of chaos.
Right, major power vacuum.
Exactly. Khrushchev's trying to consolidate his own power. And meanwhile, over in the U.S., Eisenhower's just sailed into office promising peace in Korea.
Which, to be fair to the guy he delivers on, the Korean War ends, everyone breathes a collective sigh of relief. But then things get really interesting because this is where New Look comes in.
Exactly. Yeah. It was a huge turning point in how the U.S. approached the Cold War. Before Eisenhower, the focus had been on containing communism through good old-fashioned military might, building up alliances like NATO and using things like the Marshall Plan.
Right, more of a conventional approach.
Exactly. But Eisenhower, along with his Secretary of State, this guy John Foster Dulles, they felt like a new era called for a new strategy.
And that new strategy, my friends, is where we get massive retaliation, which I gotta say sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, it had a certain ring to it, didn't it?
It really did.
Yeah.
It's this idea that any aggression from the Soviets, anything at all, would be met with full-on nuclear retaliation.
And that right there, that's why it's been so debated ever since. I mean, on the one hand, you've got the very real and very terrifying possibility of total annihilation. On the other, Eisenhower honestly saw it as a way to keep America safe without completely bankrupting the country. He truly believed that trying to match the Soviets tank for tank, plane for plane, it just wasn't sustainable in the long run.
So there's a sort of pragmatism to it, too, like trying to find a way to counter the Soviets that's, well, less costly, potentially less bloody, at least in theory.
Exactly. Don't forget, this is also a time when the U.S. is still dealing with the economic hangover from World War II. No one wants another major conflict, and the thinking behind massive retaliation was that the Soviets would be deterred simply by the sheer scale of the threat.
Okay, but here's the thing that always gets me about this whole deterrence idea. You're essentially holding the entire world hostage with the threat of nuclear annihilation, and that only works if everyone involved is acting completely rationally all the time.
You're hitting on the core issue here, and that's why New Look continues to be so controversial. Because in theory, deterrence, it kind of makes sense. But in reality, all it takes is one miscalculation, one moment where someone misreads the situation, and you've got, well, a really bad outcome.
It's like the stakes of the Cold War just went from high to astronomically high in a heartbeat. And speaking of high stakes, can we talk about the Taiwan Strait Crisis of 54-55? Because if ever there was a real-world test of massive retaliation, that was it.
Oh, absolutely. That was a major, major moment for Eisenhower, especially early in his presidency. So you've got China. They start shelling these islands of the Taiwan Strait. The islands are controlled by the Republic of China, who, of course, the U.S. is backing.
And this is where Eisenhower's response gets really interesting because it goes beyond just strong words, right?
Oh, yeah. Eisenhower basically drew a line in the sand.
He did.
He made it crystal clear that the United States was ready, and I mean really ready, to use nuclear weapons if they had to defend Taiwan. He danced around using those exact words.
But the message was clear.
Oh, there was no mistaking it. He even authorized tactical nukes to be sent to the region, just in case.
Wow. So this Brinkmanship thing, it wasn't just some abstract idea, was it? It was Eisenhower staring Khrushchev down and saying, I'm not bluffing.
Exactly. And you know what? It worked. China backed down, the crisis was averted, BUT.
There's always a but.
Isn't there always? It also raised some really uncomfortable questions about whether the U.S. was really, truly willing to push that button over a conflict that wasn't a direct attack on U.S. soil.
And did it actually make the world safer? Or did it just buy a little bit of time?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it really gets to the heart of how differently people interpret New Look. Some historians will tell you that Eisenhower's hardline approach, that it was necessary, that it showed the Soviets and their allies that the U.S. was serious about drawing a line. Others will say that it just made things riskier, that it heightened tensions and increased the chances of something truly awful happening. And this is really where the different interpretations of New Look start to come into play, because it wasn't just about this one crisis. It was a whole way of thinking about foreign policy during an incredibly tense time.
And speaking of tense times, enter Khrushchev. Stage left, after the, let's face it, brutal rule of Stalin. Khrushchev comes in talking about peaceful coexistence. Quite a shift in tone. So was he being genuine, or was this just some clever Cold War propaganda?
It's the question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. Some people, they see Khrushchev talking about peaceful coexistence and they think, okay, maybe this is a genuine attempt, even if it's just partly to thaw things out a bit. Others, they see it as a way to lull the West into a false sense of security while the Soviets just, keep doing their thing.
And what better place to test those waters than the Geneva Summit of 1955? The first time U.S. and Soviet leaders have met since World War II. So did they manage to find any common ground?
Well, just the fact that they were talking at all was a big deal. This is just a few years after the Berlin blockade, the Korean War. The world was on edge, big time. But in terms of actual concrete achievements, Geneva was more about symbolism than substance.
So more of a photo op than a peace treaty.
In a way, yeah. But you got to remember, even photo ops meant something during the Cold War. If nothing else, it opened up a line of communication, even if it was a shaky one, between the two superpowers.
But then, just a year later, you have the Suez Crisis and the Hungarian Uprising, both of which seem to throw a wrench into this peaceful coexistence idea. And they really expose the limitations of relying solely on the threat of massive retaliation, didn't they?
You're right. These events were a huge test for New Look, and in a lot of ways showed exactly where it fell short. But let's start with the Suez Crisis. It was a mess, a real tangled web, even for the Cold War. Basically, you've got Britain, France, and Israel. They all decide to team up and attack Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal.
And the U.S., their supposed ally, not exactly thrilled about this little adventure.
Thrilled is not the word. Eisenhower saw this whole thing as a huge overreach, like, hello, colonialism, haven't we moved past this? Plus, it had the potential to drag both the U.S. and the Soviets into a direct fight, which was the last thing anyone needed.
Exactly. Nobody wants a world war, especially not a nuclear one. But that's the thing with massive retaliation, right? It's not exactly a nuanced tool in the diplomatic toolbox. So how did Eisenhower apply the New Look in this situation?
Okay, so this is where those other two pillars of New Look, the alliances and the covert ops, they really come into play. Eisenhower, he used a combination of diplomatic pressure and some, shall we say, backroom maneuvering to force Britain, France, and Israel to back down. There were even whispers about the U.S. threatening to destabilize the British pound if they didn't play ball.
Wow, talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Right. It definitely showed that the U.S. meant business, but it also showed that New Look wasn't just about nuclear threats. It was about using all the tools at your disposal, even the less conventional ones, to get what you wanted.
And then, as if the Suez Crisis wasn't enough to deal with, you've got the Hungarian Uprising happening that same year, 56. And this one, it throws a whole different kind of wrench into the whole peaceful coexistence narrative. Because here you have the Hungarian people literally rising up against Soviet control, fighting for their freedom. You would think that would be a perfect opportunity for the U.S. to step in to support a democratic uprising, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it really exposed a real moral dilemma at the heart of New Look. Because, yeah, the Hungarian people were incredibly brave standing up to the Soviets like that, but Eisenhower, he wasn't willing to risk a nuclear war over it.
Man, that must have been a tough call. On the one hand, you've got these people crying out for help, and on the other, you've got the very real possibility of triggering a global conflict.
Exactly. And it really highlighted the limits of what massive retaliation could actually achieve. You can't solve every international crisis with the threat of nukes, especially ones where getting directly involved could mean, well, the end of the world as we know it.
It sounds like New Look was more of a starting point for a much bigger conversation than, a simple answer to the complexities of the Cold War. And speaking of conversations, historians have had a lot to say about New Look over the years.
You could say that again. They've been going back and forth about it ever since Eisenhower left office. It's like a whole historical debate tournament with different schools of thought squaring off against each other.
Well, we love a good debate, so walk us through it. What are some of the main camps when it comes to evaluating New Look?
All right, so first up, you've got what we call the Orthodox historians. They were some of the first to really dig into New Look, and let's just say they weren't exactly fans. Their take was, This whole thing was a reckless gamble. It brought us closer to nuclear war than we ever should have been.
Sounds like they weren't too keen on brinkmanship.
They weren't. And they pointed to things like the Taiwan Strait Crisis as Exhibit A for just how dangerous Eisenhower's approach could be. But then, as time went on, more documents became available, things that had been classified started to be released, and a new generation of historians, the revisionists, they came along with a whole different take.
So they weren't as willing to give Eisenhower the benefit of the doubt.
Let's just say they were a bit more skeptical of U.S. motives during the Cold War. They looked at New Look and said, hold on, this isn't just about defense. This is about America wanting to be the top dog to call all the shots.
Yeah.
They saw it as a way to justify things like the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran or Arbenz in Guatemala.
Right. Those were definitely some controversial moments in U.S. foreign policy, to put it mildly. So they saw New Look as a cover for a more assertive, even imperialist agenda.
Exactly. It wasn't about containing communism as much as it was about expanding U.S. power and influence around the world. But of course, like I said, it's a debate. And where you have a debate, you're going to have different sides chiming in. That's where the post-revisionists come in.
Trying to find some middle ground, maybe?
You could say that. The post-revisionists, they came along and said, okay, let's pump the brakes a little here. They weren't about to let Eisenhower off the hook entirely, but they did acknowledge that the Cold War was a very complicated time and that there was blame to go around on both sides.
So less about good guys and bad guys, and more about trying to understand why everyone was acting the way they were.
Exactly. They argued that while New Look might have been flawed, it did create a certain amount of stability in a very unstable world. Both the U.S. and the Soviets share the blame for escalating tensions, and maybe, just maybe, Eisenhower's tough stance prevented things from spiraling even further out of control.
It's amazing how the same events can be interpreted in such wildly different ways. It's a good reminder that history is never black and white. But we're not done yet, are we? Because the fall of the Soviet Union, that really threw a wrench into things, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was a total game changer, especially for Cold War historians. Suddenly, all these Soviet archives, they're open for business. Historians had access to a mountain of documents that they'd never even dreamed of seeing before. Khrushchev's own memoirs, internal memos, the works.
So we're finally getting to hear the other side of the story after all these years. I bet that was fascinating for historians to get that new perspective.
It was a goldmine, and it allowed for a whole new wave of scholarship on New Look, one that took into account what was going on inside the Kremlin during those crucial years. We call these the post-Cold War perspectives.
Okay, I'm hooked. What did these post-Cold War historians have to say? Did those Soviet archives finally put an end to the New Look debate?
Well, I wouldn't say they put an end to the debate, but they definitely made things a lot more interesting.
Oh, I bet. So spill the tea. What did these new perspectives reveal about New Look?
Well, for one thing, some historians started looking at Khrushchev's memoirs, and they noticed something interesting. They argued that Eisenhower being so willing to, play hardball, especially during things like the Taiwan Strait Crisis, it actually made Khrushchev more cautious.
Really? So it had the opposite effect of what some people might have expected.
Exactly. It's like because Eisenhower was so upfront about the whole nuclear option, Khrushchev actually became more hesitant to rock the boat too much. He didn't want to call Eisenhower's bluff and end up triggering something truly catastrophic.
So a sort of respect through fear kind of thing, but on a global scale, with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. Not exactly a comforting thought.
Not exactly. And it brings us right back to that fundamental question about New Look. Was it a force for stability? A way to keep a lid on things during a really dangerous time? Or did it just create a different kind of danger, a world where everyone was constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop? And the crazy thing is, even with all this new information from the Soviet archives, historians still can't agree on an answer.
It just goes to show that history is rarely clear-cut, isn't it? Even with more pieces of the puzzle, there's always going to be room for interpretation, for debate, for those what-if questions.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes studying this period so fascinating. Because it wasn't just about abstract ideas or military strategy. It was about real people making incredibly high-stakes decisions with the fate of the world literally hanging in the balance. So where does that leave us? With Eisenhower's New Look, I mean. Was it genius? Reckless? Somewhere in between.
It's the million-dollar question, right? The one we've been wrestling with this whole time.
It really is.
Yeah.
And like most things in history, there's no easy answer. New Look was a product of a very specific time and place, a reaction to the very real fear of communist expansion and the terrifying power of nuclear weapons. But it also forced the world to confront something it never had before, this idea that one wrong move could literally mean the end of everything.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like to live under that kind of pressure, not just for the people in charge, but for everyday people going about their lives knowing that at any moment things could escalate beyond control.
It's something we often forget, I think, when we study history from a distance. We get caught up in the events, the decisions, the different perspectives. But at the end of the day, these were real people grappling with impossible choices in a world full of uncertainty and danger.
And those choices, they continue to echo through time. Even though the Cold War is long over, we're still living with its legacy. The nuclear threat hasn't gone away. Tensions between superpowers are flaring up again, and we're still searching for that elusive balance between security and diplomacy.
Which is exactly why understanding this period, why digging into something like New Look and all its complexities is so important. Because it's not just about the past, it's about the present and the future too.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, there you have it. Another deep dive into the archives, another set of historical puzzles to ponder. But before we sign off, I want to hear from you. What did you think of our exploration of New Look? Did it change your perspective on Eisenhower, on the Cold War, on the precarious tightrope walk between peace and potential annihilation? Head over to our social media and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.